Value Impulses with Dr. Ulrich Vogel. Personnel Diagnostics Insights, Leadership, Assessments, and Personnel Development. Hello and a warm welcome, dear listeners, to a new episode of Value Impulses. We're now in Season 2. And we said that this time, we're also going to focus on the very concrete problems of our target audience, which, quite often, are things like selling services. So, when we think about consultants, coaches, and also trainers. And for that, I have a great expert with us today, who also happens to be part of the Profiling Values community. I'll introduce him in a moment, but first, a very warm welcome to you, René Reifenberg. Great to have you here.
Hi, Uli. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this podcast episode with you today.
Exactly. And in our preparation, of course, we took a close look at how we can bring together the topics of sales, selling services, and profiling. And I think it's very promising, and I'm really looking forward to it as well. But first, I want to quickly let our listeners know who you are, just to give a bit of your track record here. Were you around the turn of the millennium? For years as a paratrooper as well. I mean, I could never jump out of a plane, but I think that's fantastic. And then, in fact, 20 years. Sales experience from the ground up at Worth Screws started back then. And we actually saw in the news a few days ago that dear Mr. Worth celebrated his 75th work anniversary. I think you could learn quite a lot there. You then moved into the pharmaceutical industry, already in management roles at the Schwab Group, then regional management, then at Diagnostics Cosmetics as head of sales, so you really made it all the way to the top of sales. You also took on interim mandates, which is something you still do from time to time today. But then came the big step, which was certainly a big one for you as well. For me, it was a really huge step back in 2008, after many years. With experience in corporate, in various roles, to actually say, all right, now I'm going to become self-employed. And your company is called We Just Coaching, spelled V-I and then C-H-A-S-T. And yeah, now I'll pass the ball over to you because we also have a lot of solopreneurs in our community. So, what was it that made you decide to take the step into self-employment? And yeah. How have things been for you since then? How do you feel about it? Come on, René, go ahead and get started.
Yeah, Uli, how does one end up becoming self-employed? Sometimes maybe like a mother to her child, but primarily 20 years of sales experience, so really, that's how it happened. Coaching has always been a part of my journey during that time. I've also had the chance to learn from a lot of different coaches myself, especially during my time at Word. And even after that, at the Schwab Group, there were a lot of coaches, and even at Diagnostics, there were still coaches. I've always been fascinated by helping people fully realize their potential, which is also your slogan, Unleashing Potential. Especially in sales, for me there are these 3 levels: leadership, processes, and sales skills. And connecting these 3 things while staying authentic, that was the big motivation, the big why.
Very nice, very nice. And there's something really special about this right now. I hinted at it earlier, we've known each other for, I think, about 5 years now. We met through Boris Grundle at the Grundle Leadership Institute because back then I was doing training with him, specifically the Leading Simple Coach program, which was connected to a Profiling Values certification, and ever since then. You're also part of our community, right? And we've already had lots of events where you were there as well. And that's what makes you unique for our episode, because we can say we have the sales expert who's really seen it all. And at the same time, you also have the full know-how when it comes to profiling values. And yeah, we want to combine those 2 things really well. Maybe to start, there's a great model you've developed, or you could call it a method, called the sales elevator. We might talk a bit more about that towards the end or even in between. And of course, we'll include information about it in the show notes for anyone who's interested in learning more. But now, let's really dive in and take a closer look. With the first question, if I just jump right in, and for me, it's especially important because it gives me a different perspective. From someone who sells profiling values, I do that every day too, but from the perspective of a system provider. Can you tell us what added value profiling values offers you as a coach? And what do you tell your clients about it? And what do you actually say to them?
Yeah, so I think profiling values can do a lot more than I actually use it for myself. That's one thing. But what I do use from it is incredibly valuable to me because, on the one hand, through the report and also through the Leadership Excellence Report, for example, when I work with leaders, I can identify development areas pretty quickly. So, I can identify things much faster because most people don't have a lot of time. They want to see results fairly quickly and deliver results quickly as well. That means, if I approach this using the leading simple process, tasks, tools, principles, and then with the various sections in the subpoints, I can very quickly identify where someone needs my help the most and the fastest. Instead of really starting at the beginning and finishing at the end, because patience might run out more quickly for some people in that case. And so far, this approach has proven to be very effective.
So, I always use the expression, we immediately know where the shoe pinches. And that is perhaps
Exactly.
it. Now, what you just said, I think that's great. Of course, selling a profiling service is a different story. It's something else. Back in the day, in consulting, we always used to call it a gummy bear, but I don't know what people say nowadays. Probably, nothing is easy to sell, but profiling services might be something quite special. And that's why I want to ask you about the specific challenges you see there. You're faced with all sorts of, let's say, customer expectations. And how would you describe the specific challenges that come up when selling profiling services?
Well, I think profiling, IT is. Putting services aside for a moment, not just profiling value, there are others on the market too, but I think the challenge of selling it is the same everywhere. Because it's very versatile and, well, the applications are also very versatile. Am I more involved in the HR field? Am I working with coaches like myself? Or is it maybe managers who want to develop their own employees? And of course, it's important to identify exactly what I actually need all this for and where it can bring the greatest benefit. So in the end, it's always about the benefit, which is what makes people want it. And when the benefit is clear, then in the end, the price doesn't really matter that much anymore. There.
Because in our last conversation, we worked together quite often. We actually talked about the fact that you, well, let's say, cheap or inexpensive profilings that don't really go that deep, you compared those as well. And where already expectations exist in the market. Then it's like, yeah, I should be able to get something for €50, right? Why are you guys so expensive? How do you respond to that, or what's your take on it? What's your argument?
Well, what I've noticed myself is that there are other models out there that you can get for 30 or 50 euros. Because, of course, over the course of my career, I've had to fill out 1 or 2 professional profiles for companies in order to get a job. And I always set out to get a certain result from it. And that's exactly what always happened. Because in the end, if you approach it a bit strategically, often there are 180 questions. And in the end, every question comes up 5 times in different ways. If you can remember the way the questions are asked, then you can manipulate the system very easily. When I did profiling values for the first time, I was a bit surprised by the order in the rankings. And I had absolutely no idea how you were supposed to answer. So you just did it that way, and that was the decisive point. So I'd say, that's the difference. One of them is just too easy to manipulate for my liking, especially. It's based solely on self-assessment. That's something I'd be a bit cautious about, because people who claim they can sing well aren't always the best singers.
That's a good example. And then, of course, we move on to the next level and say, well, we can, I'm not trying to put it down, do red, yellow, green, blue. Then we can somehow identify types as well. It absolutely makes sense and serves its purpose in certain situations. But for us, it's different. It's also deeper, of course, and then it costs a few €100. Or we even get into the 4-digit range, depending on the format. And you've done this quite a few times in sales as well. What's your main argument there, before we get into the methodology itself?
Well, my approach when I'm selling coaching is based on my 3 questions. So, what should be better afterwards than before? In what time frame should it happen, and what budget do you have available? And just with the question, what should be better afterwards than before, we need to have some kind of matching point. And that's what I try to identify. Then I say, we could achieve that much more easily with profiling. And for me, it's also a prerequisite that someone does that. Because otherwise, it's just too vague and it simply takes too long to get access to someone.
Very good. So basically, a surgeon doesn't go in with old, poor-quality instruments either. And anyone who's a professional needs a toolkit that's well-maintained, so to speak. Otherwise, the work isn't enjoyable, or you might not even reach your goal at all, depending on the circumstances. I'd like to dive a bit into your methodology as well. The EVN model really stuck with me. Would you maybe like to talk about that? Explain it a bit. Maybe with some examples, because I think it's kind of like a 3-step formula. 3 letters, 3 steps is always good. That's how people can think well. What's it all about?
Yeah, so the features of products, that's something salespeople always like to have in their toolkit. That means they show up somewhere and very often, they just list a whole bunch of features of a product. And then they hope the customer can figure out how those features benefit them. So basically, it's like dumping a big box of building blocks in front of someone. And then the customer has to put it all together themselves. The EVN model stands for feature, advantage, benefit, and it's not something I came up with. It's actually been around for over 30 years. Some people also call it feature, advantage, benefit. And you can explain it quite well, with the color red, for example. So, if I just say red is a great feature, at first you really have no connection to that. But if I tell you that red is a signal color and you're easily seen, and that in traffic it means you're safer on the road, then you know, I have the feature red. The advantage is that you're easily seen, and the benefit is increased safety in traffic. That means, if I do a situational analysis and find out beforehand that safety in traffic is important to you, then I'll say, hey, we talked about this earlier, Uli, safety in traffic matters to you. The best way to achieve that is by making sure you're easily seen, and red is a signal color. That makes it more convincing for you. And if I finish off with a question, is that what you want?
Then I'm in.
If I've now turned 2 or 3 of these benefits, these arguments, into practical advantages, then I've got 3 or 4 solid points. And selling means addressing 3 levels. First, trust in the person, trust in the product, and trust in the company. And that's how I build up these levels of trust. I'm really contributing to that. And I can also raise the scale. But even so, I always ask everyone to be truly honest and not manipulative when using this. That's a very important request from my side.
Well, for me, it was definitely instructive. So I also sat down and thought, okay, what are the actual characteristics of our profiling? And for example, we have speed, as you know, ranking 4 by 18. Statements. And many people are done in 10 or 15 minutes. Some people turn it into a thesis and spend an hour on it, but that doesn't necessarily make it better. Of course, speed is something that saves time, but in terms of usefulness, it's probably something that's a bit less important these days. What's more interesting at this point, as you already mentioned, is the fact that it can't be manipulated. And with that, you can really move from talking about advantages to talking about benefits. That means I really have the person's value system laid out transparently, there's no distortion. And with that, I think I've actually increased the benefit, at least, that's how I see it. I'm just rambling a bit here, but I think when it comes to transferring things like red as a signal color for safety, I think you really have to put some brain power into the features you have, whether it's products you want to sell or services you want to offer, don't you? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, in the end, those are important building blocks for a script or a conversation guide, which you can keep using once you know your own features and the benefits that come from them. With you, there's always that great example of comparing gut feeling with science, checking things scientifically. That's also something that contributes to a sense of security, for example,
Exactly.
and you can really break that down quite nicely. Because the risk, of course, is that salespeople start off with features. I'll just call it rambling now. And then the customer still doesn't have a clear picture. So, the idea is to keep the language as clear, short, and simple as possible. And that's where writing a script really helps.
I see. Because it's only human that someone who spends a lot of time with something, and a salesperson, of course, spends a lot of time with their products, ends up focusing a lot on those features. And that's why it's so important to always put yourself in the shoes of the potential customer. And in doing so, you're actually limiting yourself a bit so it doesn't turn into rambling, but also structuring things, just like you said. So that, when a feature is mentioned, it quickly becomes clear what benefit it actually brings. And if we take it a step further, talking about rambling again, which you put well, that happens really quickly in sales, and then the topic of objections often gets forgotten. The salesperson, without a script, just keeps talking and presents everything wonderfully, maybe even at such a pace that the potential customer can't even get a word in edgewise. And then it gets tricky at the end. And you, not just you, but you explained it to me really impressively once, how so-called objection preemption works, and what's actually behind it, and how you can really make good use of it yourself. So I'll toss the ball over to you now, so our listeners can experience it too.
Yeah, so for me, objection handling is really like a duel on a rhetorical level. Because one person says, yeah, that's too expensive for me, and the other says something like, well, you'd like to have it, but you just don't know yet how you're going to pay for it. So these are the rhetorical games that go back and forth. And there are a total of 21 methods for handling objections. When I think about going back and forth 21 times, for me, sorry for the expression, but that's a verbal violation. So I really need to think about what I can do to prevent such an objection from coming up in the first place. An objection usually comes up when the customer isn't completely on board with what you're doing, or if they're fundamentally against it, or if they just simply want to get rid of the salesperson.
Then of course there are also pretexts, which you have to distinguish from real objections.
Exactly. That means if I take the objection, too expensive, for example, and use objection preemption, then I can say right at the start, our product isn't the cheapest. At first glance, our product might seem expensive. That means, afterwards, they won't bring it up again because it's already been addressed. It's been said out loud.
So you could say that this kind of objection preemption really takes the wind out of their sails.
Exactly, it takes the wind out of their sails and creates their full attention. So, the customer isn't spending the whole time thinking about what clever rhetorical comeback they could make. And Franz Joseph Strauss used an interesting method back then. He applied a really interesting technique at the time. He always had a speech written out in his office. And he left a lot of space underneath it. Whenever he made a statement, he'd leave space underneath and then go to another office, his opposition room. And in his opposition room, he'd say, let's imagine someone from the other party was standing there and said that. How would I shoot it down? Then he'd write that down and go back to his speech room. And he'd say, okay, now I'll try to work that in, exactly because this and that are the case, that's why I'm framing my argument this way. And that meant his opposition couldn't raise that objection anymore because he'd already brought it up himself. Of course, in this case, it was all about debating. But you can also make good use of this in a sales conversation. You can do that when you address the main objections: no time, no need, too expensive, those kinds of things that usually come up. If you prepare really well, you can actually anticipate quite a bit in advance.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really important aspect. Let's talk a bit about preparation and follow-up. Maybe just briefly. I myself had the chance to actually work in sales training many years ago, and I gained my own experience there as well. But of course, you shouldn't over-prepare either, as one of my bosses once told me, because then you end up wanting to unload all your prepared knowledge during the sales conversation. And sometimes that knowledge is actually secondhand, and it's not always a good idea to bring it up at that point. But if you Now, let's say you mention you have those typical objections. You have to prepare for those. But what does your preparation look like for an initial meeting? We have our listeners, the coaches, consultants, trainers, who have finally managed to get an appointment with the HR manager of a local mid-sized company. How do you approach it?
So, first and foremost, my objective. That's the most important part of preparation for me. Of course, there's an overarching goal. That means I want to make the world of sales out there a bit better, easier, and more accessible for people. The second thing is, of course, to do all that, I need financial resources just like any other company. That means, of course, I also want to sell coaching or training if it makes sense for both the coach and myself. And the third thing is, of course, also preparing the right questions. And what really helped me was focusing on these 3 questions. What should be better afterwards than it was before? How long will it take? And what's your budget? The questions sound very simple, but it takes about 30 minutes to really answer them well. And afterwards, both sides can use a checklist, which comes from the question, what should be better afterwards than before? To also compare whether they really want the same thing and mean the same thing, and to check with my program if it actually makes sense.
All right, that brings us to the last part. Wow, time really flies, René. It's amazing that you developed the sales elevator from your 20 years of experience. That's a lot of experience in the field. Could you maybe give us a quick overview in about a minute? What it is, so people can get a bit of an idea about it. Of course, anyone interested can dive deeper and get in touch with you as well.
Yeah, so the sales elevator, well, it's called elevator because you can get on at any floor, whether you're a new salesperson or you already have some experience and just want to add a few building blocks. Or, of course, there are those few natural talents in sales who might use it to figure out why they're so good at what they do.
Very.
Well said. Basically, it's made up of 5 parts, which are never unfamiliar in the world of sales. I always say, it's like 5 big cities. Preparation, getting started, the negotiation phase, closing, and follow-up. And within these cities, there are different stops along the way. For example, the EVN model or even goal setting. Synchronizing the timing, a proper greeting, and all of that, of course, requires a precise and thoughtful approach. And when I travel along this sales elevator to the different stops, and I lose a customer somewhere along the way, which can definitely happen in a sales conversation, then I have the chance to pick them up at the next meeting right where I last left them off. However, if I'm not aware of this stop, then next time I'll just do exactly the same thing again. And it's possible the customer will get off at the same spot, or just before or just after it, again.
And maybe you won't find them again.
Or you might not find them at all. That can happen too, exactly. That's basically the sales elevator, which is a really clearly structured system that ultimately provides a sales script for the salesperson. However, this script is then revised again because no salesperson loves it. No one loves sales scripts, no one likes them, and the first thing everyone says is, I want to stay authentic. And the important thing is, once the script is done, to translate it back into your own words.
Yeah, that's
And then it works, that thing.
is a good tip. So, basically, you first build it and then translate it back into your own language. I think, René, nothing can top that. That was, I think, a really good teaser in terms of what really matters. And you really brought it down to earth. It's not rocket science either. Of course, there are people who are more talented than others, but a lot of people get into the game by just sticking with it. And those who work hard have their chance. And the naturals, they definitely still have areas where they can improve, too. So, sales is something really, really great. And today, we made the connection. With profiling, and you with your expertise. So, I want to thank you very, very much for coming to Wordy Impulse. Thank you so much for your time.
Uli, thank you for having me here. It was a real pleasure to discuss things with you, as always. And yeah, I'm also looking forward to continuing to be part of the Profiling Values community.
Awesome, René. Thank you so much and see you soon. Take care. Bye. See
You soon, René. Bye.